But I want to circle back to longevity for a second, obviously taking advantage of your knowledge here. When we're looking at the plant-based diet, a lot of the time it is actually beneficial, and the mechanistic way of that, of course, hasn't been fully proved, but we do know that it reduces inflammation.
Yep.
Now, I'm not sure of this, but how exactly does inflammation affect aging? Is that how it works?
Yeah, there's actually a term called inflammaging even.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah, so you can Google that one. I mean, inflammation is at the root of so much disease, right? And one example of how aging and inflammation are correlated is that as you age, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of cellular senescence, if you know what that is.
Please
If not,
explain.
cool. So this is a antagonistic pleiotropic effect. And what that means is that something that benefits the organism when it's younger, like up to reproductive years and sort of through its good fertile years is not beneficial to the organism past the so-called expiration date. And
Mm-hmm.
so I say that because senescence is very important. It's a process of cell cycle arrest. So, you constantly have these rogue cells, right? And you don't want them to proliferate at any given moment. There can be a cancer cell developing, right? Because you have broken DNA or you have, something gets mismatched, so to speak, right? Because your cells are constantly dividing. And so it's sort of a stopgap measure. And so what happens is, and I'm giving a very crude high level example here, but as the cells are proliferating, and there's a limit to that, by the way, called the Hayflick limit, but the cell cycle will be arrested if there's damage. And that's a protective measure because you don't
Mm-hmm.
want something damaged to keep proliferating or you'll end up with cancer.
Yeah.
And so that's very beneficial to the organism through its reproductive years. The problem is that after your reproductive years, and that's like sort of a gray line, but let's say it's past reproductive years, you accumulate more and more senescent cells, and so when it arrests the cell and it stops proliferating, the cell just sits there. It's called like a zombie cell. So it's
Mm-hmm.
it's no longer proliferating, but what it does while it's sitting there is it starts to secrete the stuff called SASP, senescence associated secretory phenotype. So they're these cytokines, which are
Mm-hmm.
inflammatory, right? These inflammatory chemicals, and it's giving off these signals, and it causes neighboring cells to then senesce, right? And so now you can see how that becomes a bit of a runaway train.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why there's this whole field in aging therapeutics called senolytics, where they are attempting to develop something to either stop the senescent process to some degree or to ablate the senescent cells, meaning clear them out so that they're not sitting there in this zombie state secreting bad chemical signals and screwing up all the other cells. So that's a very high level example. And so, that's inflammatory, right? That's an
Mm-hmm.
inflammatory situation that it's creating. And so that's one example of, as you're aging, it's like a positive feedback loop, right? It's sort of that runaway
Mm-hmm.
train, kind of like the carbon cycle, where it's just is reinforcing itself. So that's one example. And so I forget what your original question was. I
Like,
went on a
like,
tangent about
well,
that.
that kind of does answer it, because I was talking about, we know plant-based diets reduce inflammation, and then that is actually the mechanistic reason why we don't want inflammation. And I'm guessing that kind of sits at, well, something we've talked about on the show a little bit is water fasting. And when you get to a certain point, you get autophagy. And is that autophagy, does that tackle, if you know, that process as well?
I actually don't know if water fasting is clearing senescent cells, so I don't want to give you a
Mm-hmm.
definitive answer, not
Yeah.
knowing off the top of my head. But I do know that water fasting does, and any fasting actually, of any kind, even Valter Longo's Prolon fast, which I've done many times, gets you into that sort of state of autophagy, so you can begin to clear away that cellular debris. And yes, if that stuff, that gunk is sitting there, it can create a state of inflammation, as can many things. And I should revise something that I said earlier, which is not that it's not that we don't know any of the, it's not that science has not understood the mechanisms by which a plant-based diet may mediate the aging process. It's that there's many different mechanisms. So in that book, Fiber Fueled, and I'm going to mess up his last name, so I won't say it. I'll just say Dr. Will with a B. Bushowitz, yes. So he talks about that, right? And I'll probably misquote it if I attempt to explain the mechanism. But the more fiber that you eat, right, the more anti-inflammatory effect you're accruing, and there's a whole reason why. And again, I don't have it in front of me, so I don't want to repeat it incorrectly, but he talks a lot about that as well. So we know that that's one avenue, and there are mechanisms involved with that. I think there are definitely more that we have not elucidated yet. And a lot of the studies are association studies, right? They're epidemiological studies, which is the criticism from the sort of anti-vegan camp, which is hilarious. Like, when you don't like epidemiology, that's, how do you think any of the medicines you take were developed, or the vaccines, or any of that stuff? So a lot of it's associative, and because it's epidemiological, you're not elucidating the mechanism, right? You're just saying, we know that these groups of people ate this way, and they had less cancer and less heart disease. And then there are also certain plants that are mediating different effects, right? So we know that soy has phytoestrogen, which is very helpful in combating things like breast cancer or ovarian cancer. So I think there's like many different ways, and I should have maybe clarified that earlier.
No,